Hey everybody, so today we're going to be looking at Reconstruction. So Reconstruction in Chapter 22, we're doing this in one or two videos because we are at the end of the year. So Reconstruction was the time period, it's a 12-year time period from the end of the war until 1877, where they tried to reconstruct the Union, bring the Confederate States back in, but there were also goals of protecting former slaves and giving them rights. So let's take a look at this chapter. This video, I'm going to move a little fast. So wartime reconstruction plans. So during the war, there was a lot of debate over this. So when I say reconstruction, like I just said, we're talking about 1865 to 1877, trying to bring those Confederate States back into the Union while at the same time trying to protect the former slaves. So there were a couple questions. One, how do we bring the South back into the Union? You can't just let them back in with no addressing the Civil War that just killed 750,000 people. How do you rebuild the South? Because the South now has no economy. Because now that slavery is gone, there's no economy. Three, how do these newly anticipated freedmen, which is the term I'm going to use that historians use for freed slaves, the freedmen, what do you do with them? How do you integrate them? They had never been educated. It was illegal to teach them to read. They had no vocational training outside of agriculture. What do you do with them and how do you protect them? And the last one is, what branch of government should actually control Reconstruction? Should it be the president? He's the executive. He executes the law, so maybe he should. The legislature under the Radical Republicans, they wanted to do it, so there's a lot of debate over this. So there was real contention in the Union leadership over what to do with Reconstruction. Lincoln, remember, wants people to be brought back in with Lincoln wants to bring them back in as easily as possible. I just had a brain meltdown there. But he did not at first want to make it necessary to have any formal protection outside of the Constitution as it was for the freed slaves. Lincoln also made the argument that individuals, not states, left the Union. Right, all through the war, he never said that the Confederacy was another country. So the whole war, he argues, no, the states did not leave. Individuals left because it was individuals. He says, I can pardon all these people or not pardon them based on how easily they come back in. He announces, does Lincoln, the 10% plan, meaning states could be readmitted when only 10% of its population swore loyalty to the Union. Well, 10% of every state didn't want to leave in the first place. That's not going to be hard to do. He also offered a pardon for every person who swore allegiance to the United States. It's a really easy plan, right? But there was one sticking point. They had to recognize the 13th Amendment, which freed the slaves, which you will see in the rest of Lincoln this week. You had to recognize the emancipation of the slaves and the 13th Amendment. 10% pardons for those who take the oath and recognize the 13th Amendment. Congress does not like the plan. The Radical Republicans wanted to make sure that black men could vote. They feared that the Confederate leaders would again take charge of all the states. So they want more than this. The Radical Republicans, let's take a look at them, they wanted what was considered a radical plan, guaranteed rights for ex-slaves, a promise that Confederate leaders would never be allowed to hold a political office again. Congress made the argument that the states had actually left the Union. Therefore, the Congress had to be in charge of this. So whereas the president can give pardons for individuals, only the Congress can allow states into the Union. So they're making the exact opposite argument Lincoln is, even though they're in the same party. They called it the state suicide theory, that when a state left the Union, the state disappeared, basically, and that a new state would have to be readmitted. And there were some in Congress who actually wanted to split up the states, chop North Carolina and South Carolina in half, make them into one big state just called Carolina, so they'd have less representation in the Senate. So Congress passes this thing called the Wade-Davis Bill, named after its two authors. This was a much, much more stringent readmission plan. They said that 50% of all people had to swear an oath of loyalty. Confederate leaders would not be allowed to vote or participate in state governments, which is pretty strict and actually made a lot of Southerners angry. Because the Confederate leadership had been their leadership before the war, too. It did not require black suffrage, meaning black voting, but it did enforce emancipation, so slavery would obviously not be there. Lincoln vetoes the bill. He thought it was too harsh. The U.S. government at the end of the war had no Reconstruction plan, and this is part of the problem. They had not really planned for this. And when Lincoln is killed in 1865, when he's assassinated, it gets even worse, because now there's no one at the helm being kind of a reasoned, deliberate leader. Remember, Lincoln was the one who said, I think I have it in here, that they should not punish the South. That the South, right, with malice towards none and charity towards all. The radical Republicans do not see it that way. And Andrew Johnson is really the most ironic president in history. He was chosen by Lincoln to be vice president, basically to get Democrats to vote for Lincoln in the North. He was a Southern Democrat from Tennessee. He was a white supremacist. He did not like black people. He was the only, if you look at this, he's the only Southern senator to stay loyal to the Union. The only one. And the reason was he hated the rich people in the South. He was poor. He was the least educated president probably of all time. And he hates the upper class in the South. That got interrupted. So he hates the rich in the South, the upper class. That's the only reason he stayed. He thought that they were old money and that he didn't get his shot. Here is the difference between these two. Lincoln, in his second inaugural, right, says, with malice towards none and charity towards all. There's no malice, right? Hatred. He is going to simply let them come back in, be our fellow countrymen again, and let's move on. Andrew Johnson says every head of family in the United States should have one slave to take the drudgery and menial service off his family. The President of the United States, who is now overseeing Reconstruction, thinks every person in the country should have a personal slave. That is a little hard for the radical Republicans to swallow. Right? That they went from having a president who pushed for the 13th Amendment, signed the Emancipation Proclamation, now to a president who says every person should have a slave. Here is Johnson's Reconstruction plan. He appoints provisional state governors, to lead new constitutional conventions. States also must declare that secession was illegal and ratify the 13th Amendment. So Johnson is going to basically say, well, I like slavery, but can't have it anymore. But you all have to write new constitutions. And they all do. If you go to North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, all their constitutions were written between 1865 and 1870. They obeyed Johnson. They did. But they passed new laws called black codes, which were laws that only applied to black people. The first gun control laws in the United States were black codes. North Carolina today, if you want to buy a gun, you have to go to the sheriff's department and get this little piece of paper that says you can buy a gun. No one gets denied unless you're a felon. But that was a leftover from the black codes. White people would go and would get the permit easily. And a black person would go and get denied. So these ran really deep. You couldn't work in certain jobs. You couldn't vote. Things like that. Congress, in the 13th Amendment, says neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, meaning if you're in prison, they can ask you to do things, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to the jurisdiction. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude is legal. Congress has the power to enforce this. Johnson tries to step in. Black codes are separate legal codes. If a white person and a black person do the same crime, they're treated differently. That's a huge problem. Although it's not illegal at this point because the 14th Amendment doesn't exist. It restricted who you worked for. You couldn't work for anybody. Well, that's involuntary servitude. It also restricted black people from testifying in court. So if you were accused of a crime as a black person, your testimony wouldn't always be listened to. Johnson approved and granted over 13,000 pardons, but Congress said these state conventions were not what they had envisioned. You'll read that in your book. So in the South, the Freedmen's Bureau was established. It was a federal program. It was meant to protect these new citizens, these former slaves. It gave them food, emergency housing, medical supplies. Remember, these people have nothing. They were slaves. They weren't allowed to have any personal property, any training. So in many ways, when slavery ends, they're just dropped. And they don't really know what to do because they had never been in this situation before. They were all promised 40 acres and a mule. The federal government would give you 40 acres of farmland and a mule. That never really materializes. They also create new schools, freedmen's schools, to educate both children and adults. Because remember, these people had never had any education. It was illegal. So you have little children in school alongside grown men. They also gave them labor contracts that were supervised by the federal government. Here is a picture. I don't know if you can hear them. My daughter is having a meltdown in the background, so please excuse that. Here's a freedmen's school. And you can see there are adults here and children. And it was basically just reading, writing, and arithmetic, right? The 3 R's, but basically a basic education. And the federal government really did help. Was the federal government standing in the way, the Union Army, between these newly freed slaves and poor Southern whites. Now, in many ways, if you're a poor Southern white, it's hard to put ourselves in their situation, but think about it this way. Poor Southern whites were the poorest people in the country, aside from the slaves. So after the Civil War, these people have nothing. They have one of the lowest life expectancies in the country. They really have no wealth. They don't have slaves, so they can't really build any wealth. And now they see the federal government handing out land and farm animals and educations to the former slaves. They feel like, hey, I never got any of these advantages. I never got any government services. Now, they also weren't slaves, so that's something to think about. But they also thought that the federal government was basically picking winners over them. So there was a lot of anger. Many former abolitionists moved to the South to help the freedmen. It was a very noble thing. They go to work in schools and help them build houses. They were called carpetbaggers by the Southern Democrats, that they had packed up a carpet bag, which was basically an early suitcase, and had moved south. There was a lot of animosity. This was a Southern cartoon that was obviously pretty insensitive, but it's on the AP exam every now and then. The Freedmen's Bureau, and it says, plenty to eat and nothing to do. Southern whites saw, especially poor Southern whites, saw former slaves really without any work, because what work was there for them to do? But they were being fed by the federal government, while at the same time they were really, really having a hard time scraping out enough food to eat. All right, so the 14th Amendment, you know what? We will tackle the 14th Amendment in a separate video tomorrow. It'll be our last video tomorrow. So check that out, and I will see you guys. Actually, it'll be Monday. See you guys then.